In the early decades of the 20th century, Europe was a continent still raw from the wounds of the First World War. Economies had collapsed, governments had crumbled, and entire populations were searching for answers in the wreckage of a broken world. It was in this climate of desperation, humiliation, and fear that one of the most deliberate campaigns of mass murder in human history took root. What followed would come to be known as the Holocaust, the state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. The story does not begin in a death camp. It begins with words. Adolf Hitler had been articulating his hatred of Jewish people for years before he ever held power. In his 1925 manifesto Mein Kampf, he outlined a worldview built on racial hierarchy, anti-Semitism, and the belief that Jewish people were the root cause of Germany's defeat in the First World War. This was a lie, but it was a lie that found fertile ground in a nation humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which had stripped Germany of territory, imposed crippling reparations, and placed sole blame for the war on German shoulders. On January the 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the legal dismantling of Jewish life had begun. The Nuremberg Laws of September the 15th, 1935, stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. These laws were followed by hundreds of additional decrees that progressively removed Jewish people from economic, cultural, and social life. By 1938, the situation had become desperate. At the Evian Conference of July 1938, 32 nations gathered to discuss the refugee crisis. Nearly all declined to significantly increase their intake of Jewish refugees. The doors of the world were largely closed. Then came the night that shattered whatever illusions remained. On the night of November the 9th into November the 10th, 1938, coordinated attacks were carried out across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed. Around 1,400 synagogues were burned or damaged. 91 Jewish people were killed in the immediate violence, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The streets were so covered in shards from shattered windows that the night became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The Nazi government then fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage. The transformation to genocide accelerated with the beginning of the Second World War. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. By the end of that year, approximately 3.3 million Jewish people lived under German occupation. They were forced into sealed urban districts called ghettos, where overcrowding, starvation, and disease killed tens of thousands before the mass deportations even began. The Warsaw Ghetto, established in November 1940, held approximately 400,000 people in an area of just 3.3 square kilometers. On June the 22nd, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Behind the advancing army came mobile killing units known as the Einsatzgruppen, tasked with the systematic murder of Jewish communities. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were shot over just 2 days. September the 29th and 30th, 1941. By the end of that year, the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators had killed an estimated 500,000 people. But the Nazi leadership had decided that shooting was not efficient enough. On January the 20th, 1942-15, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa by Wannsee Lake in Berlin. The meeting, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, lasted only 90 minutes. The Wannsee Protocol recorded the plan for what was coldly referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe. The number cited was 11 million. The Holocaust was not an accident of war. It was a plan. Death camps were constructed in occupied Poland. At Treblinka, which began operations on July the 23rd, 1942, an estimated 700,000 to 900,000 people were murdered within 13 months. At Belzec, approximately 430,000. At Sobibor, at least 170,000. Most arrivals were dead within hours of reaching these facilities. The largest killing center was Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland. Deportees arrived by rail from across Europe. Upon arrival, SS doctors selected those fit for labor. All others, the elderly children, the sick, were sent directly to gas chambers where Zyklon B, a cyanide compound, was released. Between 1940 and 1945, an estimated 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, approximately 960,000 of whom were Jewish. In Hungary alone, following the German occupation in March 1944, approximately 437,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz between May and July of that year, at a rate the crematoria could not keep pace with. Resistance existed, though it operated under conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty. In April and May 1943, approximately 700 Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto held off SS units for nearly a month before being overwhelmed. The ghetto was burned to the ground. In October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz staged a revolt and destroyed one of the 4 crematoria using smuggled explosives. They were killed. Their act of defiance was not. Outside the camps, thousands risked their lives to save Jewish neighbors. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat in Budapest, issued protective passports credited with saving tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews in 1944. Witold Pilecki, a Polish soldier, voluntarily entered Auschwitz to gather intelligence and escaped in April 1943 to report the scale of atrocities to the outside world. By late 1944, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Nazis began forcing prisoners on death marches westward in brutal winter conditions with no food or shelter. Thousands died along the roads. On January the 27th, 1945, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz-Birkenau, finding approximately 7,000 survivors too weak to be moved. Bergen-Belsen was liberated by British forces on April the 15th, 1945, where soldiers found 60,000 prisoners in catastrophic condition and 13,000 unburied corpses. On May the 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The full scale of what had happened began to emerge. Approximately 6 million Jewish people had been murdered, 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe. 1.5 million of the victims were children. Between 500,000 and 1.5 million Roma and Sinti were killed. An estimated 250,000 to 300,000 people with disabilities were murdered under the Action T4 program. Millions of non-Jewish Polish civilians and Soviet prisoners of war also perished. The total death toll of Nazi persecution across all groups is estimated at between 11 and 17 million. Between November 1945 and October 1946, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg prosecuted senior Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity. 12 were sentenced to death. Adolf Eichmann, who organized the deportations, was captured in Argentina in 1960, tried in Jerusalem, and executed on May the 31st, 1962. Adolf Hitler himself died by suicide in his Berlin bunker on April the 30th, 1945. The Holocaust did not happen because of one man. It happened because of a system, a government, a bureaucracy, an army, a railway network, a propaganda machine, and the choices of hundreds of thousands of ordinary individuals who followed orders, looked away, or participated. It happened in a modern, educated nation in the heart of Europe, which is precisely why its lessons remain so urgent. International Holocaust Remembrance Day is observed every year on January the 27th, as designated by a United Nations resolution in 2005. The USC Shoah Foundation had by 2023 collected more than 58,000 survivor testimonies. These voices carry a warning that must not be diminished. To understand the Holocaust is not merely to understand the past. It is to understand the capacity of human societies to dehumanize, to exclude, and to systematize cruelty to its most terrible conclusion. And it is to understand the absolute necessity of standing against that capacity wherever and whenever it appears. 6 million voices do not speak. That is precisely why we must.